This is continuing coverage of United States versus Sean Diddy Combs from the Hidden Killers podcast and True Crime Today.
You ever watched a jury verdict come down and thought, how the hell did they get that so wrong? This episode's for you. Because in the federal case against Sean Diddy Combs, we saw something we've seen before, but never get used to. A partial win that feels a lot like a loss. After a trial stacked with allegations of grooming, coercion, and violence, plus the infamous hotel surveillance footage of Diddy literally stomping on Cassie Ventura. The jury found him guilty, but only on 2 transportation for prostitution charges. Not guilty on sex trafficking, not guilty on racketeering, not guilty on conspiracy. And suddenly, the loudest question in the room isn't what happened in that hotel suite, it's what happened in the jury room. Because here's the thing. This wasn't about a lack of testimony. This wasn't about a lack of pattern. This was about interpretation. It was about jurors struggling, maybe quietly, maybe subconsciously, with how to process trauma, nuance, and power dynamics. It was also about who Diddy used to be. The producer in the flashy suits, the guy who danced around to music videos with Mariah Carey, the guy who soundtracked your high school prom, that Diddy. The subconscious part of the jury didn't want to believe he was a trafficker, so they didn't. And that's what we're diving into today with defense attorney and former prosecutor Eric Faddis, because it wasn't just the jury's misunderstanding of coercion, it was the prosecution's decision to go in with only 2 alleged victims. It was their gamble to let the trauma speak for itself, and it was their risk, maybe fatal, to not account for how deep nostalgia, celebrity bias, and cultural memory really goes. We talk about the one missing witness, who might have connected the dots, the prosecution's less is more strategy, and whether our justice system is even remotely prepared for the complexities of modern abuse cases. And then there's the deeper question. What if it's not the system that's broken, but it's us? Our perception of consent, our comfort with gray areas, our resistance to seeing familiar faces as dangerous ones. So I asked Eric, did the prosecution miscalculate? Or was the jury just never going to get there?
What it seems is that the jury drew some conclusions. One, that there were commercial sex acts going on. That is the basis for the interstate prostitution conviction. Sounds like the jury was not convinced that these were non-consensual. Now, that's different than saying that they were consensual. That's not what the jury decided. But the jury ultimately determined, hey, there wasn't enough evidence to determine they were non-consensual, and there wasn't enough evidence to really qualify Bad Boy Entertainment as a criminal enterprise along the same lines as like the Bloods or Crips or the Mafia. That's kind of my take.
They're not quite there. How much damage did the prosecution suffer? And this is my big one on this whole thing. When one of their key witnesses reportedly backed out before trial. And for context, they didn't have a crazy list of witnesses that were like the ones that were doing things with Diddy. There was a handful, and this was one of what, like 4 or 5? I mean, it wasn't big. And I'm wondering what exactly her voice was going to bring to this. There was talk that was going to connect more of the trafficking, more of the RICO type pieces of the enterprise, but we don't know what happened to her, and everybody's just kind of like moving on from that, which I find to be a little weird.
Yeah, when you have, I think the jury looked at Cassie's testimony and said, gosh, there's some problematic stuff here. Also, maybe consensual, not sure. And then they had Jane, the second alleged victim, and said, oh, well, seems consistent. But also, Jane, there are some issues with sort of a transactional relationship there. If they had a third alleged victim or a fourth or a fifth, there are 70 civil cases alleging similar sexual misconduct against Diddy. That could really turn the tide. That could have been sort of the straw that broke the camel's back and caused the jury to say, wait a sec, this keeps happening over and over and over again. Now I'm really concerned about the consensuality of these encounters.
And what was the government's strategy there? Less is more of let's go in with some really strong ones, and turns out, even one of them decided to, two of them actually walked away. We don't know what the other one was actually going to bring to the table. Let's bring in very specific ones, not overwhelm the jury with all of these, and because you have far more chances that if you bring 10, 20, 30 of the other ones to the table, that some may not pan out and may look false. And then, well, how do you trust the other ones? What do you think their strategy was here with so few? Did they just not have solid cases on all of these, or was this by choice?
I think there were several things going on. One was to streamline the trial. The trial, even with the 2 alleged sex assault victims, was 2 months. You don't want a year-long trial where the jury is so fatigued they don't remember anything. Also, I think that there was a concern about opening up a can of worms, and some of these alleged victims can present in a really compelling way. Some perhaps can't. Perhaps some have credibility issues, and perhaps the prosecution didn't want to risk losing some points on those other folks. But I would note in the Harvey Weinstein cases initially, they brought, I want to say, about 6 victims in the New York case to really show what they believe happened. Here we didn't see that approach at all, and ultimately the prosecution was unsuccessful with this alternative approach.
Were they just overconfident in their ability to let the evidence speak for itself? And did the jury underestimate, or did they underestimate how the jury would interpret all the trauma-based testimony? I mean, because, for some of us, we can hear it. If we've have people in our lives, if you've dealt with trauma yourself or with other people, you get it. For a lot of people, they've never been in that boat. They haven't had to have any sort of understanding of it, and lucky for them. So trying to interpret how trauma and abuse survivors cope with things is sometimes foreign territory. That's where you get the, well, why didn't they just walk away? This and that type views on things. What do you think was going through the jury's mind here?
Yeah, trauma is a messy business. The consensualness of romantic encounters can be complicated, and it can be a difficult thing. And the prosecution did present an expert to try to explain to the jury, hey, here is sort of the cycle of abuse. Here is why a person might not leave a relationship that's abusive. But ultimately, the jury, I think, saw these complicated relationships over the course of years, if not more than a decade. And then lastly, I think the star factor played a role. I think that they weren't inclined to convict Diddy, this, mogul, international acclaimed guy, of a very serious charge with the evidence that was presented that had some, points on both sides that came to light.
And Diddy, from all accounts, obviously we weren't in the courtroom, he played pretty well. For the most part. We heard a couple things where the judge had to say, like, stop making faces or such, but it seems like Diddy was being Diddy, even cracking some jokes here and there, getting laughs from the gallery. Overall, I think the Diddy that people came to know and love in the 90s and 2000s, when we didn't know all these things were going on, it seems to be how he was kind of presenting himself. I wonder that, of how much... And I wondered how much celebrity would play a role in this, because he's not Martha Stewart. He's not necessarily like super. He's not Bill Cosby either. He's a rapper, but he was a fairly safe rapper, in terms of image for all of those years. He wasn't like super gangster and street. He was, he's doing songs with Mariah Carey, and how much people, maybe even subconsciously when they're looking at this, like we may put Diddy away for the rest of his life for these things, how much they're also holding on to another time and place in their life. This guy is on the soundtrack of, if you like, pop music or hip hop or anything, and you grew up in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, he's on everything. I noticed that this weekend when I was listening to Pandora. I'm like, shit, like there's Diddy like popping up on shit all the time. I'm like, I like that. Ooh. And I'm like, yeah, I miss a time where he was just kind of the weird producer. Is that, part of the decision-making process of let's not shit on the past just because we don't want to live in a world where another person that we thought was safe was a monster.
It's so I talked or I was listening to a sociologist talk about this phenomena, and it's really, with celebrities, oftentimes we like them and we have nostalgic feelings about them, especially like you said, folks who grew up in the 90s and 2000s. They have a connection to these entertainers, whether that it's conscious or not, and they tend to want to think that, oh gosh, that person couldn't have done this, and they played at my high school prom, their songs and stuff like that.
So here's what we're walking away with: not just a legal decision, but a cultural one. This jury wasn't just evaluating law, they were swimming through years of public perception, personal nostalgia, and unconscious discomfort with nuance. And in the end, they landed in the safest place they could. Guilty of something, but not the worst thing. A nod to accountability without the full weight of consequence. Eric helped us peel back the layers, and what's clear is this. The prosecution made a strategic bet. They thought if they kept the case narrow, tight, and streamlined, they could cut through the noise. Fewer victims, less chaos, make it clean, make it focused. But what they forgot is that sometimes clarity doesn't come from narrowing the story. It comes from repetition, from pattern, from voices piling up until a jury can't ignore the system even if they wanted to. And that missing witness? That wasn't just a scheduling hiccup. That was a fracture in the foundation. When someone meant to establish a pattern disappears, the entire structure becomes vulnerable. And prosecutors didn't or couldn't fill that hole. And the jury felt it. But the bigger story here, it might be the gap between legal definitions and public understanding. What even is sex trafficking if this is not? If repeated coercion, manipulation, and control carried out over years doesn't meet the standard, then what the hell does? Are we still waiting for chains and cages before we believe someone has been trapped? And yes, celebrity matters. Diddy wasn't just a defendant, he was a character in millions of people's memories. That soundtrack of your youth doesn't just disappear when you walk into a courtroom. And jurors, whether they admit it or not, bring that bias with them. Maybe it's not conscious, maybe it's not fair, but it's real. And in this case, it likely tipped the scale. So what's next? Well, sentencing for one, civil cases definitely. But bigger than that, the justice system has to ask itself whether it's equipped to tell complicated stories to people who aren't ready to hear them. Because if we can't trust juries to understand trauma, power, and psychological coercion, then no amount of good lawyering will ever be enough. This verdict isn't a closure, it's a mirror. And it's not a flattering one. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section on YouTube if that's where you're watching us. If you are listening on the podcast platforms, be sure to check us out on YouTube. Just search Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi, and vice versa. You can listen to us anywhere you go. You can watch us on YouTube anywhere you are as well. Pick them. Subscribe to both. Then you get a little bit of everything. We got unique stuff on each platform, and we do greatly appreciate it. And most importantly, I want to hear your opinion in the comments section on YouTube. Please do leave it. Until next time, I'm Tony Bruschi. We'll talk again real soon.
Craving non-stop true crime updates? Press subscribe now and get the latest cases, analysis, and expert commentary delivered straight to your feed. Only from the Hidden Killers podcast and True Crime Today.